Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Titled Nationalism is Growing, Politicians are Stymied. Global Migration is Fueling Political Divide. Before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that this is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal by these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge. Consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. One other thing I'd like to mention is that we want to be sure you get a chance to ask questions. Here's how we'll handle the Q&A. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for that Q&A. We're using a note card system to receive questions from the audience. So at any time during the session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers. Please write legibly. If you are a student, please note this on your question card. When you finish, raise your hand and hand it to the producer who will bring it up to me. I urge everyone to please make sure your questions are brief and to the point. And now I'd like to do a brief introduction for each panelist. So first, we have John Heffernan. John Heffernan has over 30 years of experience in leadership roles in international development, human rights, rule of law, democracy and governance, humanitarian relief, and conflict reconstruction projects in the United States, Africa, South America, Asia, and Europe. And who do we have next? Benjamin Teitelbaum is an author and professor of musicology and international affairs at CU Boulder. As an ethnographer, his interests include the radical right and geopolitics, reactionary ideology and aesthetics, political theology, and research ethics. He is the author of War for Eternity, The Return of Traditionalism, and the Rise of the Populist Right. Next, we have Hadley Heath Manning. Hadley is a director of policy at Independent Women's Forum and Independent Women's Voice and a senior fellow at the Steamboat Institute. Hadley has testified before Congress and state legislators on various policy issues. She appears frequently on radio and TV outlets across the country and is a regular guest on Fox Business Network. In 2016, Hadley was named to Forbes 30 Under 30 list in law and policy. Next, we have Alexander Verbeek. He is a Dutch environmentalist, editor of the Planet newsletter, public speaker, and podcaster. He is a former diplomat and foreign strategic policy advisor at the Netherlands Ministry on Foreign Affairs. Over the past 30 years, Verbeek has worked on international security, humanitarian, and geopolitical risk issues, and the linkage to the Earth's accelerating environmental crisis. And that's just a very brief introduction to all of our speakers. They are so incredible, and if you'd like to learn more, please visit our website, and you can find much more detailed bios than I could give today. So I'd like to start with a question. The title of this panel implies, it questions whether migration is fueling nationalism. And I'd like to talk a little bit about nationalism. So can we talk about it as a concept? Does it imply patriotism, or is it something entirely different?
Well, somebody has to kick off. I'm the European in this panel, and the word patriotism is something for us that sounds like you really have to go a long time back. It's about, the French Revolution days and patriotism, etc. It's not a word you hear in nowadays politics, except when talking about American politics and just a certain segment of American politics. So it's hard to say for me if patriotism and nationalism is linked so much. What I do notice is a rise everywhere in the world of nationalism, often in a kind of nasty form. And that is not only visible in your country here. We see it everywhere in Europe as well, that roughly, let's say about 20% of the population votes now for somebody who creates a kind of fake image of history in days that it was better. When it was just our nation, it's often linked to having less migrants. But you see it everywhere in the world. You see nationalism very much used now by Putin in Russia. You see it used by Modi in India. China has always liked their breed of nationalism. It rises everywhere, and that in a period in the world where we need international cooperation more than ever before, because our problems are more international. Think about climate change, migration, etc. You can only solve them by working together. So those are my first 5 cents on starting this.
I've spent the last decades of my life conducting ethnography among people who would probably call themselves nationalists or who are otherwise called nationalists, primarily in Europe, but also in North America and in Latin America. And when I say I'm an ethnographer, that means I don't study people from a distance. I get to know them, I spend time with them in the way that an investigative journalist would, except you do it over a long period of time. And the goal, as plain as it might sound, is to get to know them in the colloquial sense of that term, to know. And one thing that you see, and this should come as no surprise to any of us who know anybody, is that when you get to know people, they are more complicated than they appear otherwise. What might have once appeared to be a sort of cartoon character figure becomes a complex, multifaceted, hypocritical human being like the rest of us. Now, in this case, in the case of nationalism, we say, what is it? Because that was your question, Vara. I could say that, yes, indeed, I would agree with Alexander that it can be an expression for racism, for nativism, for authoritarianism, for rejection of cooperation, a rejection of the ability to mobilize across national boundaries in order to address a problem. What makes this so difficult is that there's more to it. It shares space. It is a place where you meet people who address and pursue all those causes that I just mentioned, also people who feel helpless, also people who feel that they don't have sovereignty over their lives, over their communities, over their destiny. Also people who lack a sense of meaning and feel that they have no cause for their political communities, no cause for their country, or who are critical of change. Sometimes for regrettable reasons, sometimes for dangerous reasons, sometimes for very understandable and I think in cases real reasons. The challenge facing us as we deal with this issue is not, I think, to enhance and escalate our challenges and our condemnations of these people. It is to find a way to parse through, to navigate a narrow path, understanding the threats to it, while also taking serious the complaints and the grievances surrounding globalization, surrounding the movement of goods, money, and people that are affecting people in real ways.
I'll chime in and speak to the sort of what I think are nuanced differences between patriotism and nationalism, especially as those terms are used in my world, which is not the academic world, it's the world of public policy, politics, media, and so forth. So patriotism, as I understand it, is, comes from the same root word patria that we get words like patriarchy, but it means a love of one's own, love like we have within our families. And nationalism, at least as those who would call themselves nationalists or pro-nationalism, people might define it, is a collection of people who have some shared culture, history, language, something that binds them together when they form a nation state together that has rules that govern that territory, which is surrounded by borders. And so that's, I think, a little bit of a distinction. But I will say, as we're talking about the rise of nationalism in the United States, there's definitely been a marked decrease in patriotism in the United States. I think the two terms have different connotations. In general, in the United States, I would think that patriotism still has a positive connotation. However, in terms of the number of Americans who identify as patriotic or who say that patriotism is a very important value to them, that's decreased enormously just in the last generation. Only 38% of Americans in a Wall Street Journal poll last year said that patriotism is very important to them. So I guess I would count myself among those 38% of people to show, all my cards. But I think, in another sense, the term nationalist is a bit like other terms that we use in the political space. Like, I would draw an analogy with feminist or feminism. If you ask someone who identifies with the feminist cause what it means to be a feminist, she'll have one definition. But if you ask somebody out there in the political space what it means to be a feminist, well, there's all sorts of other associations attached to that word. And unfortunately, I think feminist and nationalist and a whole host of other labels get thrown around in the political debates, and they're not necessarily keeping the attachment to the academic definition or the textbook definition of what those words mean. But nationalism, I feel, has become kind of a slur towards people on the right side of politics, and an attempt to associate love of one's country or love for the nation state as the primary governing body of our world with other negative connotations. So I hope that's not the case. I'm sure it won't be the case on today's panel because this is a very elevated debate, but I'll just offer, my experience in public debates has been patriotism still considered pretty good in the United States, but nationalism sounds like a bad word.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think if you really personalize it in terms of identity politics or in terms of labeling people, I think I would rather be called, if I had a choice, a patriot than a nationalist. But I also think it's the way that you interpret these terms, and there's a real danger in using terms that are subject to interpretation and using them as labels. That can be really dangerous. And obviously nationalism in this country and around the world, they say that it's on the rise, and it is on the rise, but there are various reasons why it's on the rise, and clearly migration is hugely a factor in that equation. And I look forward to talking about the role that migration has played in fueling nationalism in this country and around the world.
Well, that takes me to my next question. I'd love it if you could all talk a little bit about how migration as an issue and as a concept plays into nationalism, and how is it that this thing that doesn't seem like it should be so related is causing this rise in nationalism across the globe, not just in the United States?
Well, I'll take a stab. I don't think we've ever, and I defer to you, Ben, but I don't think we've ever experienced the amount of mass migration on the planet that we're experiencing currently, whether it due to wars or the economy or I was on a panel last year and we talked about the role of the environment and climate change vis-a-vis migration. I've done a lot of work in places like Sudan, where you had the Darfur region of Sudan, where you had the Sahel creeping further and further south, and you get a restricted space where herders and farmers have to share it, and clearly it's going to be a cause for tension, and we see that over and over again. What was the question again?
So how is migration connected to nationalism? How is it fueling its rise?
Yeah, I think for me it's all about, the rise in nationalism is due to border control issues, and whether it be here in the United States or whether it be in Hungary or other places where people have been forced. I worked for decades in war zones and post-conflict zones where people have been forced to leave, whether as internally displaced people or refugees, and they need to have a place to go, and oftentimes, that creates tension because it's new and because it's changed. But I also think that this control is about that border narrative that we see in so many countries throughout the world that are faced with migrants coming into their respective territory.
I think it's in a way, it's intuitive for us all if we think that nationalism is about delineating a border, and suddenly that border seems to matter less than it did before, that will provoke a reaction among some people. I spent a lot of my time in Sweden. I followed the Swedish party in Sweden, Sverigedemokraterna, the Sweden Democrats, and they have had an exponential rise from their entrance into parliament in 2010, but things really accelerated in 2015 in the midst of the Syrian refugee crisis, when Sweden was taking in more refugees per capita than any other country in Europe, including Germany. But what gives us pause, I think, as we consider this question from Vara, are the ways in which immigration is actually not tied to nationalism, or something that we might call nationalism. I'll give you two examples. One is a hot spot of global right-wing populism, Brazil, and the rise of Jair Bolsonaro, who was the main antagonist and competitor of the current Brazilian president, Lula. It was just the instinct. You actually heard Republican senators and congressmen from the US going down to Brazil, helping them out, and saying, oh boy, you got to get control of the immigration problem down here, don't you? And the Brazilians would kind of nod along and say, yeah, what? They don't have. That wasn't what it was about. It was a different type of borderlessness. In some ways, it might be better, if you want to speak comparatively about this, not to talk about immigration, but to talk about borderlessness in a slightly more figurative and metaphorical sense. They did not like international. They did not like the UN. They did not like the WHO. They did not like these multinational organizations being borderless and ostensibly interfering in their politics. And the other borderlessness that they saw was domestic. It was internal. They saw that the boundaries between law-abiding citizens and non-law-abiding citizens, that gave rise to a narrative about out-of-control crime and the need for law and order in the country. That was the actual backbone of that nationalist movement, but it did decorate itself in the terms of nationalism. The other, I'm being long-winded here. The other example I would bring up is in Eastern Europe today. This is another form of nationalism. If you see a community, a nation acting in broad consensus with itself, you see that actually nations are opinion realities. They are actually existing communities and entities of sentiment that move as intelligible units. Whether you are on the far left or the far right, with some exceptions, if you are in Poland, if you are in the Baltic states, if you are in Finland, if you are in Sweden, you have been mobilized against Putin. And that is a nationalism. And for some, that is actually a fight of a nationalism versus globalism, an alternative globalism, not coming from the West, which had been the typical narrative coming from the far right, but against the ancient counter-globalism coming from the East, from Russia. So just two examples of the ways that we might want to think of immigration as being an example of something else rather than an end in itself in this calculus.
I will follow that with my thought, and I think it would be pretty simplistic, or you could create a simple narrative where the United States has been experiencing higher levels of migration, and because Americans find themselves in communities with increasing numbers of migrants, that there might be some reactionary politics to that, to say, oh, I see people in my community who are different from me, and so now I'm going to retreat to nationalism or appeal to some kind of, the way things used to be before, when our country was just our own, or whatever characterization of Make America Great Again and slogans like that, for example. So that would be a pretty simple narrative, but I think there's a lot of other things going on in our politics in the United States that are fueling concern among many Americans, that we have a disappearing American national identity. And so this goes to the heart of identity politics, but it's not just migration. It's things that relate to political movements where statues of our founding fathers are getting toppled over. People aren't showing up to respect the national anthem. We used to have core pieces of our history and our civic life that Americans across political lines shared respect for and put, common value into these things. And so I think some of the retreat to nationalism or looking for a national identity is actually driven by this erosion of what many people feel used to be a shared cultural identity. It's, yes, migration's a part of that, but I don't think it's migrants who are driving some of these things. In fact, in my conversations with people who've migrated to this country, they love this country more than many native-born American people do. So I just wanted to add that, in the rest of our political discourse, there's a lot of other things going on that might be fueling this nationalist sentiment, not just migration.
Yeah, I recognize a lot in everything that's said. And again, a bit from a European perspective, comparing it to America, this going back to this kind of imaginary past when everything was better. You see that in all these movements. So Marine Le Pen in France is saying France is no longer safe. She doesn't say from what, or for where, or from what time, but no longer. Make America great again. Like it used to be great, it's not great now, but if you vote for the right guy, then it will be great again. So I'm told. It's not my country, not my vote either. Actually, I mean, just again, might drift off a bit, but okay, we've seen this stuff in Europe, right? We've been in the 1930s. There was this guy who was an absolute loser, who looked pretty weird, who didn't have a sense of humor, who wasn't really nice. And suddenly there was a mass movement that believed that this guy, that everything that he touched in his life became toxic and failed, that guy could save Germany. People in America looked at him and thought he looks like Charlie Chaplin, And now it's the other way around. Now we in Europe, having been through this experience of fascism and nationalism, now we are looking across the Atlantic and all the characteristics I just mentioned, they're in there. So this wave of nationalism and MAGA and going back to the past and creating this one country again, where we were kind of one group of people sharing the kind of values that you just mentioned, that demands, to make it effective, it demands that you find a group that is not part of it, because you feel stronger together if you can identify a group, migrants for instance, that are not part of it. It's the same like if you want to cheer for your football club, it only works if there's another football club that they can beat, right? Because if you have only one football club, it would be pretty boring. So nationalism works by singling out another group, and that could be on ethnicity or religion or the color of their skin or something else that you can find. So then creating panic all over Europe or all over North America for migrants, especially or basically only the ones that look a bit different than we do. Because, if I would migrate from the Netherlands, as a white European guy to the US, which I probably won't anymore, that consideration. I had it in the past. Then nobody would protest, another white man, here. It wouldn't happen. So there is a kind of inherent kind of racism thing in it. And then one last thought. America is built on migration. It's like 98% of the people here. You are descendants from migrants in a time when America had not done anything to get you here except for having a kind of pull factor that this was a nice place to go to. Now the US has been the biggest polluter of our atmosphere in historic times. There's no country that has blown up more CO2 in the atmosphere than America, meaning that in the countries that have less resilience and are more sensitive to climate change, they're the first ones to feel the brunt of what climate change means. They can no longer live in their country. Large parts of North Africa are, for instance, getting so hot that healthy people cannot live there anymore for several months a year because it's just above the physical limits what we can stand. You've got similar kind of problems happening south of the US. These people are moving now to the US, the country that caused the problem more than anybody else in the first place. Unlike in the past when there was just a pull factor. Now there's a push factor from other places pushing people here. And then you close the border. I mean, I understand you cannot just open the border for everyone, but it's a debate with many facets. You have to see it from different sides. You have to see it from them as well. And how much of the crime in this country is actually caused by the migrants? How many of those shootings, which is, you know, a patented thing from the US, those mass shootings, how many are done by migrants? How much terrorists are there among those migrants? This is a country where literally more people have been shot by toddlers last year than by terrorists. It's okay, I'll stop there. Just some thoughts.
So this is an interesting question from the audience, and Hadley, you briefly kind of alluded to this, so I'd like to direct this question to you. Having lived in Germany and Switzerland, I understand how deeply the German and Swiss love their traditions and culture. Is it wrong for them to want to prevent diluting their homes by accepting large populations from other countries?
I don't think it's wrong for them. I think every nation state has the autonomy and ability to set their own migration policies. I mean, I think they should. That's part of being a nation state, is you decide the rules that are going to govern the people inside of the territory, and then you decide where the limits of the territory are, and you decide who can come in and who cannot come in. So I think that the difference may be, you know, to respond to some of the things Alexander said, is that I agree the United States is different. It is founded on the idea that all people are created equal. And we have been traditionally very welcoming to migrants. I think even today we are very welcoming to migrants. I think we're perhaps the most racially tolerant country in the world. And I think that we are also highly tolerant and even welcoming of migrants relative to many of the other countries of the world. I think we see migrants, many Americans see migrants in terms of what they add not just to our economy, which is certainly a lot, but also to our culture and to the diversity of our culture. And the American way has always been to celebrate that we are a melting pot. So we can keep our traditions and our, the cultural things that make us unique as different, ethnicities or different backgrounds in the United States, but we also need to have something that unites us together, even if it's just a respect for the basic values that all people are created equal. You know, as a woman, I look at things that have happened, for example, at the Cologne train station in Germany or in Rotherham in the UK, and I think I want people who migrate to my country to recognize that in the United States, women are equal citizens and that we're not to be abused. And so as long as you can assimilate to those, as long as you can agree to the basic rules of, you know, our culture and our values in the United States, we're not going to share every value, obviously. That's what our political system is for, to work out where we have differences in what we think that the laws and policies of this country should be. But I do think the United States can celebrate the diversity that migrants bring to our country while also continuing to be a sovereign nation state.
So I agree every country has a right to do whatever they want, but what I find problematic in that question is the term dilute. To me, it creates this kind of otherism. It creates this hierarchy of we're better than you. And I think that is incredibly dangerous. When I was doing a little research for this panel, I came across a new organization created by Stephen Miller. Does everyone remember Stephen Miller? He was the special advisor to the Trump administration on a number of things, but particularly immigration. And he's been labeled by the Southern Poverty Law Center as an extremist. And the mission statement for his new organization, which is called America First Legal, is all Americans deserve a government that puts their needs, their interests, and their country first. These principles are security, liberty, sovereignty, and most important, fundamental values are being systematically dismantled by an unholy alliance of corrupt special interests, fake news media, and liberal DC politicians. We oppose the radical left, anti-jobs, anti-freedom, anti-faith, anti-borders, anti-American crusade. When you have somebody who is in the government, and who more than likely will be in another government, regrettably, maybe sooner than later, heading up an organization and using that kind of language and creating this type of otherism, I think that's a real danger.
So we've had a couple questions about the rise of homegrown Christian nationalism. So to whomever would like to take this, how has the rise of Christian nationalism and white supremacy affected the political discourse in the United States, particularly as it relates to migration?
There's a lot in there, but I think that you can address it somewhat from something that Alexander noted. Oftentimes, I would put an asterisk next to this. Not always, but oftentimes nationalisms will mobilize against another, and it can be a foreign other, which can be dangerous. It can also mobilize against a domestic other, which is also dangerous, of course. And if those boundaries are especially rigid, if they're impermeable, if assimilation, for example, is not a relevant concept to the national myth, that is quite dangerous for the domestic others who are subjugated to the state power, and in that case, the majority. So anytime you're looking at a dynamic where a portion of the population, the majority, or even a particularly enfranchised minority, is carving out a definition for itself and for the nation that will exclude a substantial part of the country, then you're in dangerous territory. That is the presumed threat of Christian nationalism, is that this country would be on a particular religious path that would exclude and even view with contempt a significant part of the population. As a scholar, at times I feel like Christian nationalism and the discussion around it is become something of an artifact of commentary and the commentariat. That it is, there have been a lot of books published on it in recent years, and there are political figures who would align with this. Mike Johnson, I don't think that it's a stretch of the imagination to put him within that movement, and this is obviously not an insignificant figure. But we also see people who are rejecting the evangelical right in positions of power. Remember Ross Douthat, the author at the New York Times. He said, "Well, if you fear the Christian right, get ready for the post-Christian right." Because that could be coming, and that could be quite dangerous as well. And that is what we see animating what was once known as the alt-right. And also, it was represented in the Republican presidential primary. It seemed that Vivek Ramaswamy had no interest in describing the United States as an essentially Christian nation. Spoke about it as a spiritual community, a religious nation, but not a Christian nation per se. And that did not seem to be a problem with his most fervent supporters. So again, I'm repeating a theme from my previous statement, but I would keep your minds open to the possibility that Christian nationalism or these drives might be, in fact, just banners of something else, or a sheen of something else going on, maybe perhaps a more deeply rooted and ideological anti-liberalism. Lowercase l, sorry.
I agree, and some good reading on this. Nate Hochman wrote an essay for the New York Times a couple of years ago called "What Comes After the Religious Right," and it's good reading. It goes through some of the history of even how Trump came to dominate the Republican Party. His early support was driven mostly by secular conservatives, not by conservatives who attend church frequently. So that's an interesting history that I think tends to be rewritten often. But I believe, and I believe I can say this as a Christian, that Christians have a mandate to love the foreigner and to show compassion and love to everyone in our communities. However, Christians of good faith and sound mind are going to disagree on what our public policies should look like towards migration, towards border controls, towards our social safety net programs, and how those apply to citizen and migrant alike. So I would just say that if anyone is being hateful towards someone who's different or someone who's a migrant, that's not really in the way that I think Christ would have Christians act. Had to put that out there. Forgive me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I'd like to know, we're obviously hearing so much about migration on the news, throughout media, and not just in the United States, but across the world. So I'd like to know, is this crisis political or is it practical? And what role do the media or political elites play in the discourse?
I think it's a bit a question of whether it's the chicken or the egg. I think there's, on the one hand, when you see more immigration in a country of people with a different culture, you're bound to get a reaction from the people that feel that their community as they know it is changing. So then you come to the more political side of the debate, and then you see different reactions from politicians. Some say, yeah, we need to acknowledge this and take action, let's say give better education, help with integration, all kinds of other things. And you will see politicians that use this as ammunition to create more tensions and polarize society more and say these migrants are a danger. They are a danger to the values that we held dear, which makes our nation. And then it goes back again to because people see that in the media, and that influences the way they think about their original reaction. And it's interesting to follow. For instance, in my country, we have this kind of Donald Trump-like, I mean, there's many differences too, but the strange hairdo is there. We got a type like that too. I don't know where they get all these hairdos and mustaches. And it seems to be part of the thing they sign up to. And so this guy's called Wilders. He's in everything else far left of everything that you see in Trump, but he plays this migration card as well. The interesting thing is that most villages where the people vote for the guy are as purely white as the Netherlands used to be 500 years ago. There's not one woman walking with a headscarf or anything. If you look at the major cities in the Netherlands, like The Hague, where I lived for a long time, if I walk through the central shopping street, I am the minority. And the funny thing is, if you see what parties do people vote for in these big cities, that is not some kind of anti-migration party. It's just the normal political spectrum, how we used to have it. So it's kind of, I think, yeah, it's a chicken or egg thing, but I think this stroking of fear by, your village might change in the future by these migrants that you've never seen apart from on television, that seems to be a very powerful thing to rally the people. And the ones that actually, I mean, a city like The Hague, our restaurants are much better now. There's much more cultural expression. The shops are more interesting. In the past, we had only this horrible Dutch food. Have you ever seen a Dutch restaurant? I mean, you have Italian restaurants, right? You don't have a Dutch restaurant, except for maybe a pancake house. Now we got good food. So there's a lot of positive things. And I wonder why I'm living in a village now. Okay, thanks.
I think sometimes because I have a white-collar job, I'm college educated, I can also fall into thinking that all of the economic effects of immigration are good, because as a consumer I can get goods more cheaply, I can hire services more cheaply, firms can profit more because of the lower cost of labor, but cost of labor is, of course, just another word for wage. And there are some Americans who do face competition for their jobs with migrants, with immigrants, and I'm not one of them. I don't feel like my job is threatened. However, I know that some Americans do feel that way, and so I think that that's one piece of the practical problem is how do you, we need labor in the United States. We're not replacing ourselves. Our fertility rate's below replacement levels. And we have done better than many countries of the world in terms of keeping many people in our labor force because we are pro-immigration, because we receive so many migrants. However, there are practical problems that come with that. When we import labor through our immigration policy, we're not just importing widgets. These are human beings, and they have culture, they have history, they have their own different religions and creeds, and they also have needs in many cases. And we can provide services for those people, but there is a limit to how many services we can provide, and there is a cost to that. And I think that's been the experience of Sweden, it sounds like. It's been the experience of many countries that have tried to welcome mass levels of migration, and I think it is our experience now in the United States. And so it does create a practical problem, but I think that the practical problems are much harder to solve in a world where our politics is polarized and where we are, I believe, tempted to mischaracterize people on the other side. I would imagine that most Americans want there to be a level of immigration to this country that is well managed, where we have some control over who enters, but not to the point where we want to close our border and have no migration. I think that's a very minority perspective. On the other hand, I don't think that there's a lot of Americans who say, let's don't have a border. I think that that's a mischaracterization of the other side. So I do believe most Americans are somewhere in the middle. Let's try to find a balance between what we can provide to migrants when they have needs, and also how can we get as many immigrants to this country into the workforce, because we benefit when we have a strong labor force. So answering these practical policy questions will be much easier if we try to move away from the heated rhetoric and polarized debate. That's a very difficult thing to do in modern days with the landscape of our media and our political system. But it's something that I hope that conversations like this one will move us closer to.
Great. So I think we often overlook the human rights aspect. And John, I'd like to turn this question to you. In Europe, deaths from irregular migration are at an all-time high, even though the actual numbers, the number of people immigrating, are much lower. So can you talk a little bit about the human rights aspect, and how does or doesn't human rights play a role in migration as a political issue?
Yes. I think human rights play a role in every sector of our society. I do think when you're, again, characterizing people that are coming into this country or other countries that aren't originally from those countries, there, as we mentioned before, there can be labels put on these people, and oftentimes their human rights, whether they're citizens or not, are being violated. And their basic human rights in terms of economic, social, as well as political and civil rights. I mean, everybody has a right to have a roof over their head. Everybody has a right to potable water. Everybody has a right to have something to eat. So I do think as a group, if you will, there needs to be, and again, this isn't to say that we need to leave, let everybody come into this country. I don't believe in an open border, but I do think that we need to respect the rights of every human being, whether they're an immigrant or a refugee or a displaced person or a citizen or whatever. So, but I do think that the rights of the immigrant population in general, writ large, are not respected compared to others.
Great. So we were talking a little bit about nationalism as kind of it implies a border issue. In an increasingly globalized world where traditional borders are often crossed by media, by trade, how does that play a role into the increased nationalism, and especially as it relates to migration?
It's interesting. So there is. I did write a book 2 years ago. It's available for purchase outside and at fine bookstores everywhere.
You're not going to offer a discount?
I wish I could offer a discount. I don't own it, unfortunately. So, and then I spent a long time. I spent 2 years following Steve Bannon, and we heard from Stephen Miller recently, talking to him about this. And what was curious was that the discussion of borders was, as I mentioned earlier, it was almost metaphysical. It was the idea that all the borders you could possibly imagine organizing our societies were all made of one streaming neon light, and it was either on or it was off. And if you had open borders nationally in terms of immigration, you would also have unrestrained free trade. Borders between the sexes would dissolve, and we would have this gender chaos and a sexual chaos. Which every time I heard that, I always thought, man, sign me up for that. But you would have chaos, you would have disorder, and I think if you adopt that international perspective on this issue. And you try to compare Brazil, Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, the United States, you see that the underlying, the common denominator here is this fear of uncontrol, this fear of chaos. That's where you bring all these features together. And if I can just wing this into the conversation that we were having earlier, I think that there are legitimate concerns in that, but you find yourself in a terrible situation if you surrender all critical perspectives on that kind of bread and butter, yin and yang discussion that we had between freedom and order. If you surrender all critical perspectives on that, someone else is going to come up and take it, and you do not get to choose who does it. And you don't get to choose what motivations they have, and they absolutely could pick it up and run with it for the most vile and the most soul-denying and humanity-denying reasons. Then you're in a tough situation. One reason Sweden was unable to respond to some practical concerns in 2015 was because the main critical voice against migration, the main voice calling for a reestablishment of borders, was this far-right party. Everyone doubted the motivations behind their criticism, and for that reason, they had to be negated politically. They had to argue against them. It was a politics of form rather than content. And the terrible thing was that far-right party on the practical issues, they were right on a bunch of things, and everyone knew it, but they couldn't do anything. So to avoid that situation, again, some awareness that a give and take here is necessary.
I just wanted to briefly add to the question about globalization. Some things are great globalized, I think. I love that we can communicate around the world. My husband went on a trip to India in January, and we could just talk on the phone. We couldn't do that years ago. I love international trade. If it's fair trade, free trade, it's great. So having a global economy, having global communication systems, global cooperation between different countries on various things, wonderful. One thing I think is not good globalized is government. And that's because a government closer to people is one that they can better understand and participate in. And that's the reason why we have 50 states within the United States, so that we can interface with our state government. We also, of course, interface with our federal government on different issues, different matters. But I think the reluctance towards total globalization and a borderless world a la John Lennon, imagine there's no countries and no religions and none of that stuff. The resistance there is, I think, first and foremost in a desire for a nation state to maintain its sovereignty over what rules govern the people inside of that territory. Because without that, I would fear more chaos.
Now you're looking at me.
Well, we've just gone down the line.
I love John Lennon, and I love...
I was waiting for someone to break into song.
Obviously...
You're the music guy, right? Yeah.
I love everything of his vision in that song. I mean, and No Borders too is part of it. But yeah, we have to be practical, unfortunately. As a former diplomat, we would all be jobless if there would not be borders, right? So, but it's I think with the problems that we have in the world at the moment, we need more cooperation, more understanding between countries. We are, yes, you need local government, etc. You need it for the municipality, etc. I don't want the UN in New York to decide whether we will build a new playground in my village. If they would design it, it would probably be a disastrous compromise between 200 countries where no child wants to play. But we face different problems too that you simply can't solve as one country alone. First and foremost that comes to mind is climate change. You cannot solve climate change alone. It is something one produces it, another one suffers by it, and And nobody does anything because we all say somebody else should start. The US said China should start because they're polluting more now. And China says, no, in the past you created the problem, so you should do it. And they're pointing at each other and nothing happens. So for that you need it. You need it for norms too. Norms like human rights. You need to have international agreements on what are human rights, etc. There's many more examples. And since the world is getting more globalized, and since you can just call up to India on an iPhone, and you can do all those other things and trade, etc., and because people are migrating, it is becoming more and more one small planet where you can just fly to the other side of the world in 24 hours. So for that you need more cooperation. And I know that in this country there's a vast movement against less government. It's very much ingrained in the American soul of the cowboy all alone on his horse in the American West, walking out to the sunset, being alone with his gun and his horse, and that is very much this freedom image, which is wonderful. But if the rest of the world is uniting, if the products that you have used in the first hours of this day come from all over the world, your toothbrush comes from China and your toothpaste comes from Taiwan, etc., we are one world that is rapidly integrating. We have problems that are integrated too, and for that you need to be open-minded and talk to each other to work out solutions. And yes, you need borders, but you need cooperation too, so it's a bit of both here. Thanks.
So a lot of you talked about the positives of migration and the diversity and that it brings and the economic benefits, but somebody from the audience was wondering, has this diversity caused more or less division versus inclusion? And John, we'll start with you.
I don't know if it's that black and white. I can't say whether it's caused more or less. Certainly, there are some tremendous benefits. We're all sitting here, right? And we came from various places, and this is how this whole country was created. I think that, yeah, I mean, it's obviously the idea that a foreign I'm just going to put it sort of in amorphous terms, object entering into a space where you're used to something and it's change, and change is difficult to come by ultimately, right? And so you have somebody entering your space that you're not familiar, they look different, they sound different, they have different cultures, different religions, and so on and so forth. There's always going to be some type of tension. But I don't think it's either. I mean, no, I take that back. I think ultimately it's positive. I think we have to say that because, as Alexander said, we are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and if we can't accept it, then it's going to be disastrous writ large throughout the entire world. Hate to be so bleak, but.
So the term, the academic concept and label that we use in political science, sorry, I had to do this.
I've been waiting for this.
For the academic stuff, is the halo effect. When we were, Alex and you were talking about this earlier, about people who are near to but not living within diversity. Are really some of the core, that's the core demographic that we would expect to vote for anti-immigrant parties, not people who are actually having close contact with immigrants. So there's real data to suggest that real contact with people from, with newcomers, with immigrants, with refugees, can be positive and might in some way also not be the actual location of this sentiment and of this movement. Where the division could come is between, let's say, the pre-existing, the native-born population and the establishment, what they perceive to be the establishment. I can give you a quick example. So in some cases in European countries, voters for the far right have reacted not so much to the local immigrant in their community, but to a politician who gave an explanation to them for increased immigration and said, well, you know that these immigrants who are coming, they're actually more productive than you are. They're going to be better students. They're going to be better workers. They're going to be better for our society. So that's what I'm going to bring them in for. And that may be true. That might sound like a great optimistic vision for the future. But underlying all that is a logic that says, I, your elected leader, serve you no more than any person in the rest of the world. And there's a problem there. There's a democratic problem there. There's a nationalist problem. We can talk about nationalism's history as being the Charlie Chaplin mustache, as it was put before. Remember that nationalism also, its emergence is weaved together with the emergence of democracy. They belong to the same movement, the same reaction against a political formation that says that the identity of the state is the ruler. And they say, no, the identity of the state is the people who live in the state. And moreover, it's not just their identity, it's their sentiment. So it's in those places where that contract and that logic can be violated that you see divisions, I think, and perhaps the more concerning and the more politically consequential and salient divisions take place.
Great. So we have about 10 minutes left, and because I think this might take everyone a little bit of time, I'd like to ask the very easy question of, so what do we do? And I'd like each of you to say something, and you can, keeping in mind we have about 10 minutes, you can expand upon it a little bit, but I'd like each of you to take a stab at it.
Okay, so you're all watching me now. I deliberately chose in my life not to become a politician, and there's a lot of good reasons for it. So what do we do? I think at the individual level, be tolerant, be open to other people, because life is so beautiful and interesting because we are not the same. So to give just one example, since I was probably the first one here to raise the whole Donald Trump stuff in this country. I was here last year at CWA. When I left, instead of flying back to Europe, I rented a car, and for 10 days I drove out in the American West, and I spoke to all the people I met there, and many of them are quite different than you are. They look the same, but they think very differently. It was fascinating to meet all these people in villages where there's flags of Donald Trump hanging out, etc., to go to the local cafe and talk to people. And you know what? These people were so nice. And they offered me self-baked apple pie, and etc. And that is, I think, a lot of what we're talking about here is like most people in the world are actually nice people. And they may be very different from us. They may think very differently. But if we're all tolerant, make a bit of space for each other, help each other, then and that comes a bit back to what John just said on human rights. You may have, for political reasons, you could say, you know, we need quota of the number of people we can integrate in the country, etc. But each and every one of them, whether they make it to the country or not, are, you know, they're mothers and fathers and they're children, and they are humans, and they have rights too. So help them out, independent on what side of the border, because it's a small planet. We're all on this here, average about 80 years. Make something good out of it. So that's about my thoughts on this. Thanks.
The solution is complicated. We have to answer some of the questions that I mentioned earlier, the policy questions about, you know, when you have more people who want to enter a country as wonderful as the United States, one where they see great opportunity, if you have a number of people who want to enter and a smaller number that we can accommodate, that is a mathematical problem. That is a difficult practical problem. We have to decide who gets in and who doesn't. We have to decide if our immigration policy is going to be one that prioritizes family connections or skills, or, you know, we have to answer some of these policy questions, and I hope we can do it through our legislative system. I hope we can look to those that we've elected to make decisions like this to do a good job. Now, I'm just like everybody in the room, everybody's shaking their head like, oh, we're all cynics, we're all skeptical, right, of what's happening. I do, however, think that the political pressures matter. I think that we'll see the Biden administration, I think we're already starting to see the Biden administration turn towards a more restrictive and careful approach to immigration and to the border. And by the way, I think the border is, for many people, I also think Donald Trump is more of a symptom than a cause of a lot of these political issues that we're talking about. But I think many people, even people who support Donald Trump, talk about a border wall. And I think that even the border wall is, in many cases, metaphysical, but it is about having more control over who's in the country, who gets to come and who gets to stay. From what I understand, more people immigrate illegally through other ports of entry, not the southern border. They overstay visas because they've come in on an airplane or something like that. So a more strict, more careful, more restrictive, in some cases, immigration policy, I think is almost necessarily the next step, whether it's the Democrats in charge or the Republicans. That's just the way that the political pressure will naturally take us. I hope we can do it through our legislative bodies. I hope we can count on our leaders to work together to come up with compromises that prioritize the opportunities of immigrants. I mean, Ronald Reagan said, we're a city on a hill. We have walls, but those walls should have doors. And so we need our leaders to have frank conversations about what those doors look like and who can go through them. And I hope that they'll take that job very seriously. And I hope that all of you will participate in that process as well by letting your lawmakers know what you think.
Hadley wrote a great piece reflecting on your time in Chile, right? Which cites...
Sure I did. I've written a lot of things.
Right. Which cites those words. I see the riddle of modernity as being this, that we all want to be free and we all want to belong to something. That may sound very banal, but embedded in that is a formidable challenge, a balancing act for us to address. We talked about one piece of that, I think, today. The one piece of advice I would have is that we allow ourselves to be in the tension there. We don't let partisanship, we don't let the fervor of the moment or the hatred of the other, because we all do that. That we don't let that blind ourselves to the difficulty of the question, but also its pertinence in our lives.
I grew up in Northern California, north of San Francisco, and where I grew up 50 years ago, 60 years ago, everybody looked the same, everybody sounded the same, everybody was the same. It was a completely homogeneous area, and it really wasn't until I branched out and took the initiative to meet people that didn't look like me and didn't sound like me and came from different parts of the world that I think I became more tolerant. And so I think the idea of exposure is so critical, and I think that and this needs to start at a very young age in schools and in other activities related to exposing people to different ways of life. And yes, it can be done on TV, it can be done on the internet, but I think that one-on-one, that actual personal exposure is critical and can be done. You don't have to be a privileged white kid from Marin County, California for that to happen. And I think that we have tools nowadays that we didn't have 60 years ago that can help that happen. So that exposure idea, I think, is critical.
Great. Well, with that, we'll end. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to our wonderful speakers for sharing your thoughts.
Hi.
No, definitely. No.